Welcome to our fourth class in the spiritual disciplines. Let's start with a quick review. Last time, we explored the spiritual discipline of fasting. For Christians, the discipline of fasting always has a spiritual purpose. Fasting trains us to uncover what ultimately controls us, to assess what the difference between our wants and needs are. As we fast, whether that's from food or another activity, we open up space for God to feed our souls. Today, we turn to the spiritual discipline of study. Let's first discuss what we mean by the discipline of study. Study is simply learning the truth about God and others. Study helps us match what we think is real with what is actually real, actually the truth. And Jesus says something very important about truth in John. Jesus said to the people who believed in him, "You are truly my disciples if you remain faithful to my teachings, and you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." Knowing what truth is about God, about ourselves, about our friends, about our enemies, about our world, brings freedom. The spiritual discipline of study trains us to think and to discover the truth about God. Now, our goal isn't simply knowledge or winning trivia contests, but to put this knowledge into daily practice and develop wisdom. This discipline is important because how we think forms our habits in life, as Paul writes in Philippians. And now, dear brothers and sisters, one final thing. Fix your thoughts on what is true and honorable and right and pure and lovely and admirable. Think about the things that are excellent and worthy of praise. Keep putting into practice all you learned and received from me. Sociologists, psychologists, teachers, and counselors know that if a child is exposed to violence, whether on TV or social media or in their everyday lives, they're more likely to try to solve their own problems with violence. In the same way, a child who's exposed to parents who lovingly work through the inevitable problems in their marriage are more likely to deal with problems in their own relationships in a healthy way. The spiritual discipline of study trains us to think, which leads to the renewing of our minds, as Paul writes in Romans. Don't copy the behavior and customs of this world, but let God transform you into a new person by changing the way you think. It's important to distinguish the difference between studying the Bible and using the Bible for devotions. Study is more analytical, focusing on what the Bible means. Devotions focus on what the Bible means to me at this point in time. Study seeks to understand what the biblical author is saying and not trying to fit that into what we want it to say. We let the Bible speak for itself. In study, we are seeking life-changing truths, not simply good feelings. So we need to study the Bible and to use it for our devotional lives. Jesus says that when we know the truth sets us free, not that the truth alone sets us free. For instance, John chapter 3, verse 16 is probably the most famous Bible verse. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have eternal life. The truth of this verse is that God's love is so all-encompassing that he sent Jesus to save the whole world. When you study this verse, you look at the audience Jesus was addressing, what the Jews had understood about God's love in the past, and whether Jesus was proposing something new or whether he was reiterating what the Jews had already understood about God's love. Now, a devotional look at this verse would move it from God loving the abstract world to God loving me as an individual. Look at John chapter 3 differently. For God so loved, put your name there, that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have eternal life. Notice how the goals of using the Bible in study and using the Bible in devotions are different, but how they support and enhance each other. Study provides a framework within which meditation and devotions can function effectively. The discipline of study trains us how to think so that we can experience the freedom the knowledge of the truth brings. And this will transform our lives. Now let's outline 4 steps in Bible study. The first step is repetition. Repetition keeps our minds moving in a specific direction. When I was in medical school, one of the pet phrases of one of the urology staff was, "Repetition is good." Every day, we'd have to go over and over the physiology of the kidney. And was it ever painful for someone like me who had no desire to deal with the kidney in practice? Later, in my OBGYN residency, I learned that one of the best surgeons I worked with reviewed his basic pelvic anatomy every night before he went to the OR, even though he'd done thousands of pelvic surgeries. He was ingraining the pelvic anatomy in his brain deeper and deeper. With repetition, we return to the same books, the same topics again and again to ingrain the truth in our brains. Memorizing Bible verses is a way to practice repetition. The second step in study is concentration. We all know that multitasking is a myth. We learn best when we concentrate, when we center our mind on what we're studying. The human brain has a natural ability to concentrate, to focus on a few of the most important stimuli we're receiving every moment. If this wasn't the case, we'd always be aware of how our clothes felt against our skin or the position of our legs. But our mind is able to focus and ignore our clothes or what it feels like to sit on a chair. Unfortunately, our culture doesn't always appreciate concentration. It continually throws distractions our way. We think we can scroll through our phones and listen to a friend's conversation all at the same time. And we've all done it. And we've all felt bad when our friend is upset because we're not giving them the attention they deserve. But when we repeatedly focus on a particular subject and give it our full concentration, we can reach a new level of comprehension, which is the third step in the spiritual discipline of study. This is the aha moment, the time when it all becomes clear, when the light bulb goes off over your head. It's the time we have the knowledge of the truth, when we come to understand reality. This launches us into a new level of growth and understanding. The final step of study is reflection. Reflection helps us to uncover the significance of what we're studying. This is the step that moves the knowledge that you've gained from your head into your heart. We move from understanding the subject to understanding us. We begin to see things from God's perspective, that our eyes do see and our ears do hear. The final outcome of study is to hear and see in a clearer and a new way. We study to gain wisdom, not just knowledge. All of this must be covered in humility. We may gain information, but if we think we know it all, we won't gain wisdom. We will never graduate from the discipline of study. We must always remain teachable. Finally, let's look at the practical steps of study. Many of you are already in a Bible study. Let me suggest a pattern that's helpful as you mind for the goal that the Bible holds. There are 6 key questions to answer as you study the Bible. The first is, what is the author saying? It is important to begin with this question because we must discover what the author wanted the original audience to hear. We're separated from the biblical audience by 2,000 to 3,000 years. We need to learn about the cultural differences between our individualistic Western culture and the group culture of the ancient Near East. And we need to know the history of the time. For instance, the land promised to Abraham and his descendants went through multiple name changes throughout history. As an example, let's look at a verse from Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. Jesus said, "If a soldier demands that you carry his gear for a mile, carry it 2 miles." When we study this time in history, we learn the Romans occupied the country of Israel. We discover that the Roman soldiers had the right to command a Jewish person carry their gear for a mile. Now, Jesus says to his followers, don't stop at carrying the gear 1 mile, but go the extra mile. The information about the Roman occupation helps us understand Jesus' teaching a little better. The second question to ask is, what does the author mean? I call this the "that was then, this is now" question. We need to bridge the gap between first century Palestine to our 21st century Western world. If we understand Jesus said we need to go the second mile with the Roman soldier, what happens if we aren't occupied by a foreign force? Can we ignore this teaching since we don't have a foreign military living in our community? What Jesus is teaching is how to treat our enemies. Instead of giving only the minimal effort necessary to live alongside your enemy, Jesus calls us to do more, to give greater effort to work with our enemies, to show them kindness and mercy. Now we realize Jesus is speaking to us and our circumstances too. The third question becomes, is the author correct? This is the step where we begin to analyze what we're reading and to interpret it. Now, if we're honest, we tend to jump to this step before doing the first 2, and then it's no surprise we come up with some really goofy theology. Instead, ask, does what the author say make sense, or are they proposing something that's really stupid? In our case, we ask, should our enemies be treated this way? Why? Or why not? The next question calls upon our own experience in similar circumstances. If we skip this step, we'll really miss out on relating to what we're reading and studying. We get stuck in the information stage without moving to the knowledge and wisdom stage. For instance, we relate differently to grief if we're grieving ourselves. In our example, we ask, what is our own experience of dealing with our enemies? What happened when you tried to go the extra mile for an enemy? What happened when you didn't go the extra mile? How do you relate to your enemy? Next, we broaden our view and consult other sources to increase our understanding. Here's where Bible dictionaries and commentaries can be helpful. Especially important in Bible study is reading the books that come before the text you're studying. We tend to approach studying the Bible as though we're reading a third book in a trilogy without the benefit of reading the books 1 and 2. It's hard to get the whole gist of the story. For instance, it's really hard to understand the New Testament book of Hebrews if you don't have a handle on the Old Testament, because Hebrews draws heavily on Old Testament imagery and theology. Now, in our verse from Matthew, we want to know what the Old Testament says about how we're to treat our enemies. Is Jesus confirming what has been taught through the centuries, or is he challenging his followers to rethink? Finally, we ask how others in the faith community interact with the text. We need checks and balances of the community when we study. If we rely only on our own personal interpretation without honest conversation with others, we can stumble into a situation that can lead to cult-like behavior, which unfortunately has happened in the past when the Bible was misinterpreted. When we study in a community, we gain new understanding from others' insights and experiences that enhance and broaden our own comprehension. Now, returning to our example from Jesus, we should seek out others who have the experience of living where they feel threatened, where they're the minority or the weaker party, or have lived surrounded by an enemy. These are 6 good questions to ask as you mine the Bible for the timeless truths it holds. Now, there are several approaches you can use to pick what to study. You could read a major book straight through, like read Genesis in just a few sittings. This allows you to experience the whole story and not just little bits and pieces. You don't take a 2-hour movie, watch 4 random 3-minute clips, and then think you understand the story, right? Unfortunately, we tend to use the Bible this way, picking a few stories here and there. Or you could pick a short book like Ephesians or 1 John and read it through every day for 1 or 2 weeks. This gives you the time to soak in the text. And don't be surprised when you hear or discover new things each time you read it. Another option is to trace a character and discover how they change and grow. Take a deeper look at Deborah or David, Nicodemus or Martha. You'll be surprised at how rich these characters are. However you practice the discipline of study, know that God will use it to show you the truth and transform you more and more into his image. Now, some important takeaways for today. The spiritual discipline of study trains us to think and discover the truth about God. The goal of study isn't simply knowledge, but wisdom. Humility must be the foundation of study, for we never graduate from learning about God. I'd encourage you to download the additional resources on the web. They contain discussion questions as well as the steps and key questions to help you practice the discipline of study this week. Thanks for joining us. Next time, we'll turn to the spiritual disciplines of simplicity and solitude. Until then, keep the faith.